Welcome to this episode of Visionary. I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Annise Rogers, who's recently completed her PhD on the Four Zoas, and in particular what she calls the Urizen cycle as an antidote to the Orc cycle that's frequently discussed by Blake scholars. In this episode, we're going to be talking a little bit about the Four Zoas, how Blake came to write it, what it means, and who are these actual characters that are included in this great unfinished, or is it incomplete, epic that Blake was producing at the turn of the 19th century. Could you say a little bit about when Blake started to write it? Because we were talking about this earlier. And whilst the common acceptance is that Blake begins it in 1797, that's not automatically the case, is it?
No, so the title page says 1797 on it, but the title page is actually quite nicely put together with Blake's what I call his posh handwriting, which he uses for when he's then going to print. So it says 1797, but I think the first two nights are in that kind of handwriting in ink, and so it's probably started 1796, maybe a little earlier, but no one's really entirely sure, but we usually say 1797 simply because it says it on the title page. So it's a nice, easy number to remember. In the same way that we don't really know when he stops writing it, except for it's before he publishes Milton. So everyone has sort of a different idea about when it's finished. So I usually just follow 1797 to 1806-ish.
Yes. And actually there's quite a bit of discussion about the fact that Blake clearly seemed to be working on this when he went down to Felpham. So for those who don't know, and actually there's another podcast on this, the writing of the hymn Jerusalem, where Blake leaves London in 1800, travels down to Felpham and spends 3 years, the only time in his life he lives outside of London. And during that time, he's clearly working on and reworking and trying to complete the Four Zoas. I think we'll just refer to it as the Four Zoas, but we'll come on to the title in a moment. Um, and because it's never completed in this way, what we're left with is this incredible manuscript, which is held at the no British.
British Library.
I was going to say the British Museum, the British Library. Um, and it's this incredible manuscript. How many pages is it about again?
Oh, a lot. That's not very helpful, is it? I think probably because I've never actually seen the physical copy because it's deteriorating very quickly, and you need special permission. I tend to think of it as pages in the Erdmann um book, but it is. Hold on, I should go on the Blake Archive. That tells me how many objects are in it, which means how many pages. So it has 139 pages, and then it has another one, six added additional bits,
Yeah.
other pages that move around. So it's quite a long poem. It's over 4,000 lines.
Yes, and it's Blake's longest poem. I mean, just sticking to the page count. I mean, Jerusalem, which is the longest finished book they produces, that's 100 plates that are engraved and printed up. So the Four Zoas was already going to be a longer, in a sense, an attempt at a more complete work than anything else that Blake attempted during his lifetime. And
Yes.
we have it on the form of it. If you could say a little bit about that, because I think people who do encounter the Four Zoas, I was lucky enough in the early 1990s when I was kind of doing a trip around various archives to see the manuscript edition and kind of go, oh, this is incredible. And it was already clearly deteriorating then, very badly. And I've not seen it. It's never been on display since then, unfortunately. Um, but it's of course that kind of how Blake came to write it, literally as on scraps of paper, on bits and pieces that he found, including the back pages, the reverse sides of a particularly important poem. I'd probably like to talk about that a little bit more, which is Edward Young's Night Thoughts. So who was Edward Young, and why is the Night Thoughts significant to the Four Zoas?
So Night Thoughts by Edward Young. Edward Young is a priest, I believe, that writes a very long, interesting poem called Night Thoughts that pretty much was very, very popular in its day. Like everybody read it. Blake absolutely loved it. Nobody reads it now unless you're studying Blake, and it is a drag, I think is probably a good way to put it. It's very
Well,
of its time and it's very long. But Blake gets asked to do the like the illuminations for it. And so he spends a lot of time and a lot of money. He never finishes it. It sort of makes him bankrupt. It's a big disaster. Doing doing the pictures for Night Thoughts. But Night Thoughts is more important than just he uses the pages to write for the Four Zoas. It too has 9 lights. It's a dream over 9 nights. So he literally like nicks the format. It's almost like he reads Night Thoughts and goes, I can write this, but my own way. So he uses it, and he doesn't just use the occasional page of Night Thoughts. He uses a lot of the pages of Night Thoughts because they have bits missing for where Edward Young's words go. So he can write in the gaps. It's a nice way of saving money on paper, and then he'll write on the back as well. And quite occasionally you can see how the pictures from Night Thoughts are influencing what he's writing about the Four Zoas, even if it's not on the exact page. You can see how it's connected. So yeah, Night Thoughts for him is kind of like this catalyst, if you like, to make him write his own kind of big worldly mythological structured poem. And like the endeavor he did to create the pictures for Night Thoughts, the Four Zoas also sort of flops. He never gets any further. He never publishes it.
yes, I mean it's worth saying a little bit more. Richard Edwards, I think, is the publisher of the version of Night Thoughts that Blake's working on. I mean, this is a huge project, even by the general standards of book publishing in the 18th century. This is a massive book, literally in physical size, as well as the number of plates that Blake will produce. And he's paid, I mean, he's paid quite a pittance, but so the designs is paid virtually nothing. But the aim is that he'll then do the engravings, which will actually generate revenue from the sales. And there's a number of factors that influence this. I mean, one, first of all, I don't think either Edwards nor Blake actually realize how much work it's going to be. You know, an adventure of this kind is a massive amount of labor. I think as well, particularly because Blake is engraving the pages, not using his traditional etching technique, so it takes longer. So there's massive amounts of labor involved to produce this, but also for both of them, they have the great misfortune that the Napoleonic Wars, instead of coming to a quick conclusion in the mid 1790s, carry on being dragged out and on and on and on. And the book market collapses. There's an economic crisis, and suddenly people are not spending the equivalent today of several £100s on a single edition of a very popular poem, but one that they can't justify the expense of a very lavishly illustrated book. But yeah, I love your comments there. Nobody reads Night Thoughts unless they're studying Blake, and I have yet. I know loads of Blake scholars who read Night Thoughts. I've yet to meet anybody, including 18th century scholars, romanticists, who read Night Thoughts. I was going to say for pleasure. That seems perverse. As you say, it's very much a book of its time, and it's just fascinating how a book that was so popular, so widely read, is just not picked up at all these days. Partly because I think that very, I was going to say religious, but Blake is incredibly religious, and people read Blake, but a very conventional Anglican, high Anglican kind of approach to religion that feels very much of that 18th century time. And it fits in just before we move on from Young. It fits in. It's often classified with the kind of the graveyard poets, meditations on death, on the tomb, on the mortality of things. And the only one that people tend to read these days is Thomas Gray's elegy, written in an English country churchyard, which is wonderful and a lot shorter.
Much shorter, yeah.
But the stimulation then, I mean, we're going to that kind of that link, the stimulus of Young's Night's Thoughts cannot be underestimated. Blake would not have attempted the Four Zoas if he hadn't read and been working on Young's Night Thoughts in the 1790s.
No, and I think that if you're studying the Four Zoas and you don't read Night Thoughts,
Yeah.
you're doing yourself a huge disservice.
Mm.
Because you can't understand how he goes, ah, that idea, I'll change that because I don't like how Jung said it, or oh yes, I've illustrated this and now I'm going to connect it to this part of the Four Zoas. And I think it's almost like trying to read the Four Zoas and not connecting with Blake's idea of Christianity at all. You just lose something.
And you've also, I mean, you just reminded me of something actually, a comment there that he's responding to Jung as well. And of course, Jung himself was responding, amongst other things, to Milton, because Milton was the great epic writer, the great epic poet that nearly every writer in the 18th century who tries to write a long poem is responding to Milton. So there is a sense, I guess, in which the response to Jung then becomes a testing ground, a preparation for the response to Milton, which will follow in Milton, a poem. Um,
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not going to discuss it in detail here because we're doing sort of like an overview of the Four Zoas, but there are a lot of points in the Four Zoas where suddenly there's a lot of Milton, and it's obviously a response to Milton, and he's moving away from the classics or from Young and is responding directly to Milton the poet.
Absolutely. And I know you've done a lot of work on this in the past, but you know that transition where the Miltonic element starts coming much more significantly. Some of the influence of that, of course, comes from his time in Felpham, where he's working with Thomas Haley, William Haley, sorry, William Haley, and and Haley, whilst Haley is not much read as a poet anymore, Haley is probably the best, the greatest Milton scholar of his time. Actually, you know, he's incredibly significant for the work that he does. So that move to Felpham, you know, Blake working on the Four Zoas, revising the manuscript, trying to get it finished, eventually abandoning it. I mean, I think some for personal reasons, but some very much for kind of structural and conceptual reasons. But all of this work being done under the increasingly burdensome relationship that he has with Haley, who, and again, you and have written on this and talked about it previously, but the fact that Haley tends to get very short shrift these days really does neglect the fact that actually he really helped complete some of Blake's education in some quite important ways by, you know, just simply by giving him access to his library, if nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, Haley's working on some some work so is an on an edition of Haley, on an edition of Milton, while Blake's there. I mean, it's not he's not connecting with Blake. Blake's not got anything to do with it, but we know they talked,
Yeah.
and they're going to talk about things that they like. We know that Haley was reading him Homer, trying to get him to translate out of the Greek. So he's really helping him that way. I cannot under any stretch of the imagination, imagine Blake walks into a library and doesn't have a quick look round to see what's there.
Well,
And Haley's library is full of the most up-to-date criticism. He is like a personal private school, if you like, and Blake's just like, yeah, I'm going to learn everything. I mean, not everything he learns from Haley he likes. We only have to look at how he interacts with Klopstock. But he's introduced to a wider variety of criticism and maybe what today we probably call scholarly work
yeah.
than he would have done before. So his attitudes to things start to shift and change.
And of course, that first year that Blake was at Felpham, he was decorating up. It was Haley's library, wasn't it? I have to remember.
Yes.
Yeah, and Haley's not there for a lot of that time. So for a year or so, Blake has pretty much free run of his house in Felpham, which was incredible. But coming back to the I was going to say coming back to the Four Zoas, but actually, is it Vala or the Four Zoas, or indeed Vala or the Four Zoas? And actually, that title, because I mean, you've got it as your kind of your screen behind you, you know, Vala crossed out, you know, and actually, and also a point that you've made previously is that nobody ever actually ever refers to it by the full title, which is.
Which is, give me a second because it's so long, I have to read it.
Yeah.
Um, the full title is The Four Zoas, Vala, or Torments of Love and Jealousy in the Death and Judgment of the ancient man, A Dream of Nine Nights, in some variation because he's added it in between, and
No,
it's a hugely long title.
snappy. I mean, actually, Blake could be incredibly snappy. Songs of Innocence, America, a Prophecy, but this is not one of those. So, could you say a little bit about the transformation, the transition between Vala, the Four Zoas, and indeed that role of, you know, the death, the torments and jealousies, and the death of you know, the primeval man.
Yes. So it starts off as Vala, which I pronounce Vala because Vala is usually connected with veils, and it stops me from trying to say Vala, because that word comes up as well. But there's no judgment on my part. You can say it however you like. Um, so it starts off as Vala, who is a character. She's the emanation of Luva, and she sort of appears earlier. She's in like earlier Blake books, Blake poems. After the Four Zoas, she expands. She becomes a very important character in Jerusalem. But it's he's following his preset thing of the Book of Loss, the Song of Loss, the Book of Ahania, the Book of Urizen. Oh, I know what we'll do. Vala. And it sort of is about Vala, but the first character is actually Tharmos and Ennion, so it's you just get confused straight away. And while it starts off obviously being about Vala, the emanation of Luva, it suddenly becomes clear that actually it's about the Four Zoas, who are, well, they're the Four Zoas. I think that's the only way you can sort
The
of
four
explain them.
ones who are in every man.
Yeah, the as Jason said, they're very greatly described in Milton. It is in Milton, isn't it? Um, And so he moves away and says, okay, instead of focusing on this one character, I'm going to focus on these four characters instead, which actually ends up being a focus on eight, or nine, or 10, depending on which way, but we'll come back to that later. Um, and so he sort of changes the title because he realizes it's wrong. Now, there's some discussion about whether the first 2/3 nights are actually Vela, and then the later part is the Four Zoas, simply because the first three-ish nights are written in ink and then added to, and then after that he sort of uses his his normal scrawling handwriting rather than what I earlier called his posh handwriting.
Fair copy.
Fair copy, yeah. I yeah. Um, and most people will call it Vela or the Four Zoas. Although there tends to be most people will just these days will just call it the Four Zoas. In earlier criticism and scholarship, it might have been called Vela, but these days it's usually the Four Zoas or FZ. Quite often it will just come up as FZ. But why he changes the title is obviously because he changes what the poem is about. He has no idea what he's doing. He suddenly goes, "Oh, I'm writing a completely different poem. I need to change the title." Jason also asked about torments of love and jealousy. Well, the torments of love and jealousy are between the Zoas and their emanations, but also between Zoas and other Zoas and emanations of other Zoas' emanations, which is all very complicated, but it makes sense in your head. So the male characters who are the Zoas, they have this jealousy with one another, but they also have jealousy about their own emanations, who are predominantly female. But the emanations will then will be jealous of other emanations and the connection they have to what they consider their Zoa. The ancient man is shockingly Albion, who we don't actually who we haven't come across before. We actually have this is the first time Albion appears in one of Blake's poems, and he sleeps through pretty much the entire poem. wakes up
Alvin's
once.
very good at sleeping.
He's
Yeah.
he is very good at sleeping. He wakes up once, tells Urizen to like sort out the world, go back to sleep, and then wakes up in night the ninth and sort of like is like the world is rubbish. Let me change it to how I think it should look. And unlike the Albion that you see in predominantly Jerusalem, this Albion is not a particularly nice character. And I think that's true of most of the characters in the Four
Yeah.
Zoas. None of them are really very nice.
Yes. I mean, Blake, it's really interesting that Blake writes, and actually, this is a big difference between the Four Zoas and Jerusalem, the emanation of the giant Albion. Um, it's not even that they're anti-heroes; they are not heroes. Each,
No,
each of them is basically power playing in the psyche, the soul, the spirit of Albion, and each of
yeah,
them is trying to get the upper hand, and it's very vicious in that regard.
yeah,
Pretty
you
much in
have,
contrast to Jerusalem's, where loss is often taken as the avatar of Blake, his representation of the poem, and it's
yeah.
clear focus for the reader, which doesn't exist in the Four Zoas.
No, the characters all want to be God.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
Louvre is like, I am king.
Yes.
Tharmos just wants to take control. Los is like, I can do all these things. Literally, Urizen says, am I not God who is equal to me? And I am God, the terrible destroyer, not the savior. So they all want to take this godlike role, and then they realize that they can't actually do it.
Yeah.
But they aren't
Goes wrong
heroes,
every
but they're
single
not really villains either. They're just it's a constant power struggle where everyone wants to be in control because they think they're better than everyone else.
There's an element actually putting those terms, that constant power struggle. There's an element sometimes where bits of it remind me of the kind of those depictions in Homer, in particular of the Olympians, where it's sort of like, wow, these are the moral guides of the ancient Greeks. It's kind of like they just want to have sex with each other. They want to fight each other. They want to destroy things, and then occasionally Zeus kind of goes, "Oh yes, I meant to be the moral compass for humanity. Oh yes, I better do something good for a change." But more often than not, it's about who's going to trick who and who's going to sleep with who, which is actually not dissimilar to some of the activities going on in the Four Zoas, and perhaps it's worth saying a little bit now, as much as we can, keeping it a short summary. What happens? What takes place in the Four Zoas? And I know how difficult it is to answer that question.
Um, so the best way to start is the fact that it is a dream over 9 nights. And so you've got night the first, night the second, and then it's not quite as easy as it seems because there is two night the sevenths. And then night the second doesn't actually say night the second, it says night the first rubbed out. So you just assume. You have to assume that there are 9 nights. Depending which version you read as well, can cause some issues. So if you read Erdmann, it's 9 nights with night the seventh. If you read Keynes, it is 9 nights with two night the sevenths. And it is all dependent, and it is something that lots of Four Zoa scholars tend to get to the point where you have to just accept that there are different versions. It's not a fixed text, it's very movable. What happens? Well, I'm not going to give you a step-by-step guide because I'm not actually entirely sure. But it is about the rise and fall of each Zoa,
Yeah.
but not necessarily in that order, and definitely not linearly. So it starts with Tharmos, who's sort of like falling apart already. His emanations have been hidden. He then, by Ennion, who is his emanation, she then sort of runs away and he drowns his sorrows, which I love that phrase because it really works well with Tharmos, who is sort of connected with water. You have then sort of like the birth of Los and Enethamon, Los of it being a manifestation of another Zoa who's Orthona, and Enethamon being his emanation. And they go on to have Orc, and it's sort of a retelling of what you see in like the Book of Los and the Song of Los. So you know sort of what's coming. You then have Ahania and Urizen literally is like throws her out because she starts saying things that he doesn't agree with. So she also falls down into the void and non-entity. He then goes on a big walk. Basically, he goes on a massive walk. He then takes Vala and makes her become his harlot, and she loses her identity as Vala, and they burn Los in the furnaces of Urizen, which is the only time it ever appears in Blake, the furnaces of Urizen. In one of my favourite scenes where he literally melts away into rivulets of metal, except for his feet, which are left. And at that point, he sort of transforms into Orc, who has at this point already been bound to the earth by loss. So everything's sort of happening at once. Think of it as a bit like a massive episode of Doctor Who happening. That's how I always think of it. Everything's happening all at once. You then have Urizen going on these many walks, and he then meets with Orc, who he recognizes as Orc, but does not recognize as Luva. They get into a massive conversation slash row, and it's sort of a fight of dominance between the two. And Orc transforms into like a dragon serpent thing and becomes Urizenic. And then, of course, that's Night the Seventh, which there is an alternative version where it doesn't involve Urizen in the same way, and it involves the shadowy female who is the fallen version of Vala. And the same thing happens to Orc. In Night the Ninth, in typical Greek, kind of Greek tragedy style, Blake doesn't know what to do. So instead of having the gods come down, he just has Christ appear out of nowhere, get crucified, and disappear off again. And everything's sort of rounded up. Everybody's sort of fixed, sort of ish. Night the Ninth starts with it's kind of they're in the wine presses, but the grapes are all the humans. And everything, for the Zoas at least, is sort of everyone's back in their boxes. Everybody's where they should be. Everyone's connected. All of the Zoas are working together to form the complete whole. At which point Albion arrives, messes it all up again, sort of can't decide how he wants the world to look, so leaves the world in a state of disarray. Where it says that religion and sweet science reign. So it's sort of like he takes you to the edge of what is the apocalypse and then just leaves you there. So yes, in a very basic terms, that is sort of what happens in the Four Zoas.
A couple of comments to make there. I mean, that end, which we'll return to, that of course is slightly more, well, actually not slightly, much more controlled. That's actually what happens in Milton a Poem as well. You end literally with Albion awakening, and you're at the point of the last day of judgment, and the poem stops. And then Jerusalem is clearly intended by Blake as his attempt to work through that. What does apocalypse actually mean if it's completely transforming human senses and perception? So, I mean, a comment you made, the difficulty of explaining the narrative of the Four Zoas. At least there is kind of a narrative. You can see that Blake is trying to tell a story. In Jerusalem, he's trying to tell poetry from the perspective of eternity, which by definition doesn't have time, therefore doesn't have narrative. So, and is basically, there's things like Eliot's The Wasteland or Ezra Pound's Cantos, etc. That's the only stuff I can think of that's perhaps closest to what Blake's trying to do in Jerusalem. Whereas at least, I mean, actually, one of the things that fascinated me with the Four Zoas when I first read it was, and I think it was the Erdmann version I read first, which does a pretty good job of keeping some kind of story going. And I was madly into science fiction and fantasy at the time. And this kind of was an absolute, this read to me like the first fantasy epic, an attempt to create a world in which there are these monstrous characters all at war with each other. And I had no idea what was going on. But but this kind of vaster, bigger than big, bigger than life kind of interpretation. And then I went on to read Milton's Paradise Lost, and right, okay, the war in heaven. It's all those echoes that are taking place in Milton's work as well. Um, so we kind of, in terms of a brief summary, knowing that it's very difficult to pin down what the Four Zoas, the poem, is about. What about the Zoas themselves? Who are they, and why do they matter? Sort of, yeah.
Well, like a character guide.
Yeah.
Yeah, a character guide, yeah.
Yeah.
So the Four Zoas are Orthona, Luva, Thamos, and Urizen. Now, to confuse us even further, Blake very rarely uses Orthona and will use Loss.
Yes.
So Loss is who we're going to use. Loss is well, he's Loss. He's the same, but not the same character that appears in the Book of Loss and the Song of Loss and the Book of Urizen. They're sort of the same characters, but they're not quite the same. Don't argue with me, Blake scholars, because we all have differing views on this.
Yeah.
Some will say that they're the same character throughout Blake's mythology. Some just say they're the same names done differently. I am not going to discuss that here. But there's four of them. And this is the first time we meet Thermos, the Four Zoas. Also, the only poem where he has speaking lines. That's very important. Now, each of the Four Zoas has many emanations. They don't just have one, but they have their main emanation, who we will talk about. So, Urizen's emanation is Ahania, who you all know from the Book of Ahania. Luva's is Vala. Tharmos is Ennian's, and Los's is Enetharmon, who is called thus because her parents are Ennian and Tharmos. So they're the four Zoas with their four basic emanations. But of course, then Luva, when he falls, becomes Orc.
Yeah.
So Orc is also sort of a Zoa. He's just the wrong version of a Zoa. So you've got six, really. You've got Orthona, who is Los. So that's two. You have Tharmos, you have Luva, who is also Orc, so that's two, and then you have Urizen. Now, Urizen is predominantly the only character in the Four Zoas that doesn't change from the previous ones. Okay, so Los is a complicated character in the Four Zoas because he goes through multiple transformations and developments as a character to the character that you see in Milton and Jerusalem rather than from the one from the 1790s. Very different character. Urizen, he stays pretty similar. He's the same. Luva gets some actual talking roles and some good points in the Four Zoas for a change. But predominantly, Vala takes centre stage when Luva is around. So if Luva is not Orc, not being the same character there, Vala will take over. Vala is my argument is Vala should have been one of the Zoas. Like she is fantastic. Vala and Ennian, they should have been Zoas, but Blake stuck with male Zoas, female emanations. I'm going to leave it there for characters because it is a very complicated, vast array, and the sons and daughters of Zoas and their emanations can also be emanations, but the emanations can also be other Zoas by a different name. So we're not going to go into that because it's much too complicated.
I mean, I think the one thing that I would add to your description there is also the fact that just this emphasis on that several times in Blake's poetry he talks about the Zoas as being portions of the great man. That he's quite clearly at certain points to say Blake is quite clearly doing anything is tempting. But that some point times he seems quite clear that he views them as aspects of a human psychology. The one that's quite often held up, although I'm sharing it now rather tentatively because I think it's probably wrong, or you can find examples where it doesn't work. But Urizen, your reason is often held up to be, that's the one that seems most sensible. Luva is often held up as the passions. Tharmas, the body, and Earthona, intuition. Thank you, Blake Dictionary and Esphos the Daemon for that. However, there's plenty of examples where, and just sticking with loss, sometimes is anything but kind of intuition and that kind of spiritual sense. Sometimes loss is completely and utterly fallen. And at other points, particularly in the later poems, he does seem to be that persona, that personification of Blake operating through his own poems. So I agree with the entire. I've always had problems, always had problems with critics who attempt to pin down too definitely, to fix very firmly what Blake meant by these characters that's why I was rather hesitant of introducing, Urizen means this, Luva means that. I think particularly when you're starting out with Blake, that's really helpful. And then if you start reading more and more Blake, you realize, well, if Luva is the passions, etc., actually no, let's stick with Urizen. If Urizen is the intellect, then what happens all those points, particularly in Milton, a poem where, sort of Milton, Urizen, who is Satan, becomes full of rage and passion. And one of the arguments is that Urizen has tried to usurp the position of Luva, etc. But for me, it demonstrates both. I'm going to say this quite carefully. it demonstrates both a failure on Blake's part, but also what makes him most interesting as a poet. Because I think, in contrast to a lot of writers of his day and later, and Swedenborg's an obvious example, Swedenborg has this sort of sense that there are clear correspondences. You know, if you can just see the world, the universe in enough complexity, you'll see all the bits and pieces fit together like this crystalline structure. Blake Blake actually seems to be much more interested in process. You know, it was a friend of mine, Steve Clark, who first drew my attention to the fact that I'd been commonly just rejecting Urizen. Urizen's the bad guy. Urizen's the enemy. Urizen's evil. And Steve Clark's comment was, Blake knows that Urizen is part of himself. The four characters he's referring to are William Blake in different aspects. And Blake could be incredibly Urizenic, incredibly stubborn, always know what was right, get himself. And Urizen is William Blake as much as Loss, for example. So I think Blake as a poet then becomes absolutely fascinating when you realize that he's doing something I don't think is really taken up consciously until like postmodern and post-structuralist literature, where, you know, sort of rather than a fixed characteristic, a key, he's actually taking you the process of creating your own mythology by giving you the inner workings of how this can be transformed.
Yeah, and this connects quite nicely with Night Thoughts again, because that he does, Edward Young does have these kind of fixed, rigid death,
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
temptation. They're characters and they mean what they are.
Yeah.
Whereas Blake's like, hold on a minute, no. And when like so, for instance, the spectre of loss who appears in the Four Zoas, no one's really sure what's going on. I mean, I have read many critics who have very, very different views on what and or who the spectre of loss is. But in the end, for me anyway, it doesn't really matter because they're a part of loss. So loss, even the Zoas aren't as rigid as they first seem. So Loss can do some horrific things in the Four Zoas. He does some awful things. Orc does terrible things all the way through. But Urizen can do some fantastically wonderful things, some very beautiful things. And it's almost like Blake saying, look, all these parts of ourselves, they are not rigid or fixed. So yes, Blake could be Urizenic, but
Um,
he, sorry,
I,
yes, Jason.
I've just forgotten for a moment the scene where Urizen creates the heavens. You know, he's literally hanging the nets and sort of the stars in the skies. Is that book two or book three? I always forget.
Oh, I think it's book
Yeah,
two.
it's
Don't
just
hold me to it.
it's one of the most beautiful pieces of poetry. I mean, and it is. It's drawing upon, you know, the Psalms. You know, sort of the motif of the Ancient of Days circumscribing the universe. It is truly sublime. What Urizen does is incredible, and then it all comes crashing down, kicks out high, and it just this beautiful superstructure, this incredible cathedral of intellect that Urizen's built, all
Yeah.
crumbles and disappears. But it is astonishing.
Yeah, I mean it's very beautiful where he walks through the different fallen worlds of the Zoas have each tried to create, and he falls through like this. It's not like a portal because he falls into non-entity, but he falls through world after world after world, and it's terrifying, but sublimely beautiful at the same time. This night the sixth where he walks through the dens of Orthona, it's one of those moments of absolutely riveting Blake sublime that's almost Burkean, that kind of Burkean dark sublime. Um, but it's one of those points that when you read it, you have no idea what's going on, but at the same time, you know exactly what's happening. And so I think that Blake mixes this kind of ideas of what is good and bad and what is beautiful and what is ugly and sort of like, it's like no throws them all in together and you sort of get especially in the Four Zoas you sort of have to decide for yourself. I mean, we'll come to Night the Ninth later. Night the Ninth is spectacularly written. It's absolutely amazing, but what it's actually about is terrifying. um
I was going to say before we come to night night, because sort of deal with the conclusion, the end of the poem. I just wanted to return to a point you made that Edward Young, you know, had very strict correspondences between the meanings, which of course was incredibly common to the kind of personification of 18th century poetry. One of the things I find fascinating, this is just a moment to talk a little bit about Blake's poetic technique. So there's an assumption, I think, that when people first come to Blake, this seems like nothing else you've ever read. And then you go back to 18th century poetry, and obviously Milton is an important precursor. But you read some of the 18th century stuff, and you realize that Blake himself had imbibed a whole host of poetical techniques, of which one was personification. That poets all the time in the 18th century would sit, and there's death striding over the horizon, or there is time
Mm,
with his mighty scythe and stuff like that. And what they're using is a rather flat form of symbolism. I think Coleridge himself, he particularly rejected this allegorical type of reading
mm.
of Blake. And what Blake sort of does is he takes these ability to use personifications, to use abstractions, but I think a very simple thing it does, which is mind blowing, and I think he is the first poet to really do this, is he gives typical personifications such as anger, reason, wrath, etc., and he gives them names which he has entirely made up. He makes them proper characters. So they're not simply abstract, flat symbols, they're not allegories, but Orc as rage, Urizen as reason become incredibly complex interrogations of those human emotions, those human understandings. And that's one of the things that for me just makes Blake constantly fascinating as a writer, as a thinker to return to.
Yeah,
He,
so if you've got Urizen, for instance, out of Urizen, you'll get Fuson and Palalambron, and they're each a different part of a critique of reason, and you're never really told which bit they are. So you sort of have to work it out yourself. So it's very it with when you're reading Blake, even the Songs of Instant Experience, I think you have to engage with it. You're meant to be active. You're not meant to just sit there and be like, "This is nice."
yeah. Although
Um,
it is not nice,
Not nice.
but
Yeah, but what you were saying about personification, I think that Blake, he does engage with it in poetical sketches and then breaks away from it. He gets it out of his system very quickly. He's like, I can do this. I want to do better.
yes, but even in poetical sketches, I find it absolutely fascinating. So the Couch of Death, etc., which is
Mm,
is both on one level a completely 18th century piece of writing, and then on another like nothing else you'll have read in the 18th century, um, where he uses these abstract terms, but then immediately, so from the very beginning, is trying to do stuff that's closer actually. I think he's trying to do stuff that's close to the Bible. He's trying to do stuff, you read the book of Genesis, you'll have entire chapters where there's a string of names who never appear anywhere else. And you've no idea who they are. But I mean, my favorite, Methuselah, who walked with God after, what was it, 1,000 or however many years, and then doesn't appear ever again. So there are just these astonishing transformations of perception that Blake is trying to do, which I think a lot of he takes from the Bible. Whereas, of course, with the allegorical systems that 18th century writers inherited,
mm.
these had their roots ultimately in classical literature, where and also I think to be fair to the classical writers, they were much more fluid with their deities. But in 18th century Britain, it's kind of, oh no, Apollo is the god of virtue and light, and etc. That they saw these strict hierarchies.
Yeah,
And Blake is one of the first writers of what we will then come to know as romanticism, which just breaks this apart. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, especially like this listing. This happens a lot in the Four Zoas. For instance, this is a bit from where it says, "These are the sons of Los and Enethama." Now, most of these characters just don't appear again.
Yeah.
Rintra, Palalambron, Theotormon, Bromion, Antimon, Anaton, Ozath, Ahana, Sotha, Maidon, Alayol, Nantha. And as you go down, and these are the daughters. And then you get this other list, and these characters just don't appear again.
And that is pure Genesis.
Hmm.
That's the book of Genesis with all those genealogies that
Yeah.
take
But
place.
then again, they also appear in like Maccabees as well.
Yes.
So we I discussed that somewhere else. But we talked about this idea that lists, they're not very poetical, but they're very biblical. These kind of, and this is the son of so and so who was the son of so and so. Um,
So, drawing to an end then, Night the Ninth, which, as you've already mentioned, so just one of the most incredibly beautifully written, it's proper apocalyptic poetry
mhm.
Blake engages with here. So, what's going on Night the Ninth, and why is it so important?
Well, my favourite quote about Night the Ninth is that it's the greatest abortive masterpiece in the English language, which is Northrop Frye on Night the Ninth. Everybody quotes it, but it is right. It is right. What is happening in Night the Ninth? The end of the world. But it's actually called The Last Judgment. It's Night the Ninth the Last Judgment. So it is the Last Judgment, and it is the harvest of humanity. And basically, humans are little grapes in the wine presses that are being squished down and made into the wine.
Yeah.
And all the Zoas have become their proper forms again. Luva's back, Urizen's back to normal. That they've all reunited with their emanations. So it's the Last Judgment, but it's not particularly what you'd want. It's very edge of apocalypse. And then Albion wakes up and he goes, "I know this isn't right.
Yeah.
This is not how I see the world. Let's change it." So he goes to change it, and then it ends.
Yes.
So you sort of like, and then what happens is end of the dream.
So, like, what's his name? Bobby and was it Dallas waking up just to deal with. Sorry, that's a very old reference. TV viewers from the 1980s. Um, the question that we were sort of discussing earlier on, but when we prepare for this talk, is it is it unfinished or is it incomplete? What
Okay,
happens with Blake's? Why does he abandon it? Why does
okay.
he think?
I read a fantastic article, and you'll have to forgive me because I can't remember who it was by, who said it was finished but incomplete. Now it has an ending. It
Yes.
has a perfect ending. And Night the Ninth is written before some parts of Night the Seventh. So he knows how he wants it to end.
Yeah.
But it's never finished. It's finished, has an end, but it's incomplete. Why? Because it got too big. He doesn't know what it's doing anymore. It starts to become unwieldy. So he what is their name? Calls it. I can't remember. Rosso calls it his prophetic workshop where he works everything out for Milton and Jerusalem. But it doesn't start like that. At least I don't think so. And he keeps it. He wants it. But it becomes too complicated, and it becomes sort of like a playing ground for working out the characteristics of characters. So this is the last time Orc has speaking lines. The Four Zoas in Night the Seventh. He doesn't have any more lines after that. He doesn't talk in Milton or Jerusalem. So we have this kind of playground where he's trying to work out his whole mythological structure and put it down, and it doesn't work. So instead of trying to build on it, which he does because if you look at the manuscript, you can see he's added sections or crossed them out or moved them round. He just goes, let's start afresh. And he decides to move on to Milton, a poem, but it's slightly more complicated than just that. He's actually moved away from what he thinks poetry is. His idea of what poetry is has changed. So in 1799, when he writes to the Reverend Dr. Trustley, he says, "Homer, Milton, these are amazing. These are
Yeah.
fantastic." And if you read the beginning of the Four Zoas, the Song of the Ancient Mother, who and you have strong heroic verse, it's very much like a Homeric epic. And it's full of the Four Zoas is full of rape and violence. The first part of it is exceptionally like Homeric battles, waves, all this kind of stuff. And then he moves and it becomes much more Miltonic. He moves into inner feelings, inner thoughts, very much more romantic, if you want. So he the poem itself changes. It's sort of like starts as one thing. He's written the end, then he goes back and changes parts of it, and it just falls apart. It isn't what it started at. It isn't what the end is. So instead of going, "Oh, I'm just going to keep writing this," he goes, "Nope, going to start again. I'm going to write Milton a poem because that's what the Four Zoas has become, a sort of a response to Milton." So it starts as Homeric epic, then becomes sort of a response to John Milton, and then he goes, "No, it's not doing that either. I'm just going to start Milton a poem instead." At least that is how I think
And
it
there's
falls
also
apart.
your comments that letter to Reverend Trustler in 1799 celebrating Homer, and then of course Milton a poem begins. It's Homer, Virgil. These are the ones who infected, the malady of that infected Shakespeare and Milton, etc. And actually has become, in some respects, and I use this word in a very narrow sense, he's become an anti-epic poet in the sense that he refutes utterly the ethos and the worldview of the classical epics, etc. So, of course, if he starts the Four Zoas thoroughly celebrating, and actually one of the reasons why I think the Four Zoas, whilst it's still difficult to read, it's also brilliant to read because there's a huge amount of action in a way that there isn't in Milton, a Poem, or Jerusalem. Those are much more. Oh, you said the comments in terms of a kind of Christian epic. They're closer to Paradise Regained, for example, than they are to Paradise Lost.
Hmm.
And it's about the struggle of the soul rather than literal combat and physical violence, which of course is what gives poetry its action in many respects. Okay, so
Okay.
um, I think that that comment of finished but incomplete, which in a sense marks our conversation today about the Four Zoas, because I know we will be returning to this. So finished but incomplete, and we shall return to to other aspects of the Four Zoas. So I'd like to thank again Dr. Annise Rogers for joining us and sharing her expertise on William Blake's Vala, or is it the Four Zoas, or is it indeed Vela? I realise I've slipped between the pronunciations. And please do join us again in future, where we'll discuss other aspects of both the Four Zoas and also other parts of Blake's poetry. Thank you.